Welcome, friends, to Reality Test. What is reality testing, you may ask? Well, it's something we all do every day, maybe with our loved ones over dinner, with coworkers at the water cooler, etc., when we check our subjective or personal emotions, thoughts, and so forth against objective or sort of more agreed upon fact-based reality. Although, because Dr. Ray and I, Dr. K, are social constructionists, we don't actually believe there's one true objective reality, but rather our own personal versions of it constructed in the context of relationships. But you get the idea. So here in Reality Test, we're going to be testing the castmate realities and the producer antics of our favorite reality TV shows against what we know as licensed psychologists about the reality out here, off of our TVs. We hope you'll join us as we attempt to reality test. Listen, y'all, we have a lengthy version of our disclaimer in the show description text, also in our old episodes, but we do ethically need to at least include part of it at the start of each episode. So here's our briefest version of the disclaimer. If you've heard it before, you can skip ahead 30 seconds, or for the old episodes, 2 minutes. So although we're licensed psychologists, psychotherapists, supervisors in the context of our professional roles, we are not acting as therapists in the context of this pod, neither for you nor for the reality castmates we discuss. We will give our opinions as our whole human selves, albeit supported by our psychological knowledge, and we will talk about diagnoses rather than assigning them, as we cannot ethically assign diagnoses without formal psych assessment. But both the opinions and diagnoses we discuss might easily be erroneous, as we don't personally know the folks in reality TV shows. That's it. Thanks, y'all. Now check out our campy theme song.
Are you feeling stressed? Your head's all messed? Well, let's forget all the rest. Fuck it, we're blessed. Cause it's time to talk reality test. Come with us. Let's reality test.
Welcome to Reality Test. I'm Dr. K. Feel free to check in and take a seat wherever you like. We are solo podding today while Dr. Ray is off doing important things for work. So we're going to do some recaps. We're going to do recap episodes on the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City, season 5. We're looking at episodes 1 through 5 here. A whole lot happening in these episodes. We are also just going to start off with a little check-in just because I wanted to share about a movie I watched about a serial killer. It's a little bit of a trigger warning, I suppose, because I'm going to talk about a real-life serial killer in order to talk about the movie I saw on Netflix. The movie is called Woman of the Hour. It's directed and starred in by Anna Kendrick. The movie itself is about Rodney Alcala, who is also called the Match Game Killer. He was the one who was on the Match Game on national television. And actually won. He matched with the woman, and then they did not apparently go on the date after all because she figured out he was creepy when she after the showing went on a quick got a drink with him right after the show. Realized they should not be going on a date later. So the movie itself is based on true events, and we learn quite a bit about another victim in addition to the Match Game Killer. The Match Game woman who was not a victim. She survived because she figured out that he was creepy. Didn't see him again. Apparently was almost a victim, though. The other victim, though, that I found very fascinating and also survived was a teen runaway who used his humanism or sort of humanized herself to him in order to survive. And it worked after he had thought he'd killed her and raped and killed her. So it was really interesting subplot of the movie, but then also just in general, it's such an incredible story about how she did so and survived. So, wow, moving. The movie is actually called Woman of the Hour, and I think that's supposed to be about Anna Kendrick's character. In fact, I'm positive it is because that phrase gets used about her. But I have to say, I think the real Woman of the Hour was the runaway victim. So, wow, moving. Some random fun facts I learned, and perhaps we shouldn't use the phrase fun facts when talking about serial killers at all, but some facts, little tidbits I learned by looking at the Wikipedia page after watching the movie. One was that around 1971, Rodney Alcala worked for Blue Cross Blue Shield. While working there, he worked with Richard Cottingham, who turned out to be the torso killer, Times Square Ripper. So an additional, quite prolific serial killer. It says we're unsure whether they knew that about each other, that they were both serial killers, but worked together in the 70s, early 70s. He also worked under Roman Polanski at NYU, so studied under him, learned under him. So, wow. And then, interestingly enough, that Roman Polanski is the one whose wife was then murdered by another different serial killer, Charles Manson. So, creepy. And then lastly, Alcala, one of his victims who he killed, was a 23-year-old daughter of a nightclub owner. But she, Ellen Jane Hover, was also the goddaughter of Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. Wow, what a connection. And we really don't hear about that. Very upsetting. Granted, every single death and murder was upsetting, and there are probably many, many more than what he admitted to, clearly. So the estimates are like upwards of, I think, 130. Ooh. Awful. So I suggest seeing the movie. I mean, obviously, I think you should see it if you're a true crime nerd. If you're not, you might find it really disturbing, but it is well done. And it's probably disturbing for all of us anyway, in many ways. So that's my little check-in. I watched that movie and I really enjoyed it. So we're going to move right along now and start with the recaps. Recap for Real Housewives of Salt Lake City. Let's get started. Episode 1. This is the premiere episode, obviously, and we start right away with the castmates telling us about how hard it is to be on the Housewives franchises, because they show us all what usually people will try to hide, and yet they have to show it, and then they have to wait for our opinion after they film it. Interestingly, well, first of all, they say, like, that's why we band together. We have each other's backs and so forth, which we don't see a whole lot of right away in this episode anyway, too. The other thing I just wanted to mention that was odd was that in the picture that they end up taking, where they're each holding a snowflake or whatever, it's interesting that Angie is in the middle, like forward and in the middle, almost like she's the main character. So interesting, because she just last season was a friend of. Look. So this whole first episode is about Lisa's Bezos event. Bezos meaning kisses. It's her Valentine's Day event. We also see a flashback to 2 weeks prior where she was telling Heather and Angie about the party. She was also complaining about who she didn't want to invite. Specifically, she did not want to invite Whitney. So we find out why, and that becomes a huge subplot for us, which is that before all of this happens, we see that Whitney was on a podcast, and the host asks her, has she ever apologized without being dismissive? And Whit said, no, she doesn't care about anything other than being right. Lisa's always been the villain. So those are some tidbits we hear of things that Whit said on the podcast that now Lisa seriously takes issue with. So we'll keep going back to that plot line. We see Mary and Angie arrive for the Bezos events, arm in arm, in heels and a long fur coat. They were showing up to the Bezos party, Lisa's Bezos party, with matching purposes. So that's part of how we understand that actually they've become quite close friends. We find that this is true because of a flashback that we see from when at the reunion, Angie let Mary know she had something on her teeth, lipstick, I suppose. She has some lipstick on her teeth. And then from then on, Angie has just really, been in Mary's good graces. That really won her a place in Mary's heart, which is really cute, I think. We also get to know that we have 2 new cast members for Real Housewives of Salt Lake City, both with B names, Bronwyn and Britt. Britt is really the touch point for Mormonism. So she is the kind of like the new Monica. So one of the things that Monica served last season was that it allowed us to see Heather talking about Mormonism and what she doesn't like about Mormonism as she tried to coach Monica through kind of leaving the church. So similar here, where Britt is uninterested, sort of. She became disillusioned with the church recently, and so she's sort of interested in pulling away from it. Bronwyn, on the other hand, is sort of a Broadway producer, and she is also a huge fashionista. So we do, get to know a little bit about that role. Not a whole lot. I'm hoping we'll learn more about that as time goes on. But we heard a lot about Britt's. So other things that kind of come up with Britt's storyline, and then we'll come back to Bronwyn's in a second, is that she's dating an Osmond nephew. So one of the Osmonds' nephew. They've been dating for 8 months, but they've broken up apparently during that time 16 times. We kind of learn later, like, are they ever actually really dating when she thinks they're dating? So we've, for example, never seen him on camera for a long time. But then when he is, so he isn't in the first couple episodes. Then when he is, we see him say on camera that they had spent 7 months together, not 8. And that he also says as best friends. So, it looks like they're not actually necessarily dating. Bronwyn, on the other hand, at least at the Bezos party, we see her show up with a big heart coat. Okay. Where Britt showed up with Heather as sort of her plus one, Bronwyn came alone, and Lisa runs up to her and says, I didn't expect anything less about the very fashionable heart coat she's wearing. Lisa says she's known Bronwyn for about 7 years. Bronwyn tells us on camera that her brand is quote unquote funny chaos. And she said, for example, right now I'm dressed as a Tim Burton character and I feel great. So at the meal later, we also learn that Bronwyn is in a relationship with a 26-year older husband. And she has some stepkids with him. She also has a daughter of her own, Gwen, from a previous marriage, or previous relationship, I should say. So this becomes a recurring plotline, though, about her current husband, being older. Really not something we spend a lot of time on everywhere, but it does seem to be a recurring plotline here and there. We also, for example, see her kind of shit on him a little bit. Like, she kind of goes after him for having gout and says, like, I'm with somebody who's at the age where they could have gout. It turns out you can have gout at a lot of ages, including at 30, It has to do with drinking. If you look up the common age or sort of average for gout, the common age range is 30 to 60 years old. Women are also more likely to have it after menopause. It's actually a type of arthritis, which I did not fully know. It's also associated with kidney problems. I don't think for Bronwyn with her husband, the way she kind of went after him in a couple different ways. Like, one is talking about him behind his back, and one is right there in person with him. So I don't know, that feels kind of icky. I don't love seeing her down him like that, even if he is older. I think there's one thing about, like, getting out in front of something and being the one to make fun of it first. There's another thing about, like, too much of that. There is too much of that. So, I don't know. Be nice to your husband. His name's Todd. So we see a scene with Bronwyn and Mary sitting on a bench, kind of, recognizing each other in proof that they're both on the fashionista side of things. So Mary, compliments Bronwyn's coat, and Bronwyn compliments Mary's and says, which of course I own. So they're having a good time together talking about it. And then who sits down but Brittany with them on the bench, okay? Sits down right in the middle. And first thing she says is, "I love your costume, Bronwyn," which is just a huge no-no when it's clearly fashion. I'm not sure it was clearly fashion to her. Frankly, wasn't to me either, kind of, but that's not something I would say I know a lot about. When Bronwyn does explain it, she says that there's 3 of those coats total. One that Rihanna owns, which, by the way, Rihanna loves Salt Lake City franchise. Very fun. One that's in a museum, and one that Bronwyn owns. Kind of funny. So Mary also shares a little bit more about growing up without things. She didn't necessarily say she was poor, but just growing up without. And Brittany just sort of like jumped on that opportunity to try to bond with Mary and ended up making it worse. For example, Mary talks about, sort of growing up without much, but she meant like her mom wasn't paying much attention, I think, to the kids. Not that they were poor. So Brittany uses that as an opportunity to bond over having been poor. And Mary's like, I didn't say I was poor, and sort of gets offended by that. So it's just like one thing after another, Brittany putting her foot in her mouth during the scene. It's tough. We actually see Bronwyn straight up say, "I'm learning fashion isn't her thing, but I now know words aren't her thing either." Rough. So some other random moments from episode 1 before we move on to episode 2. Oh, no, actually, there's still the second sort of half of episode 1 and then episode 2. But some other random moments before we go to the meal of episode 1. Mary says to Heather, so Heather, by the way, lost a good amount of weight because she went on Ozempic, which she's been open that that's what it's from. I think that's really nice, some awareness building around that. So then when she shows up to the party, Mary says to her, "You look pretty and thin. You're thin." And Heather kind of loved that. So she remarks to us like, "Oh, that's what Mary needed to be able to see me or, to like me." So, yeah, it's bad. It's tough. I think in general, we see Heather kind of preoccupied with her weight, which makes sense when somebody feels not good enough based on their weight. So we actually come back to this, by the way, at the end of episode 5, where Mary brings up that Heather champions things that are a lie. For example, the black eye issue, but she also says that she's championing body positivity, but then went on to publicly critique it. But Heather responds, "That's my point, though, is that we say that body positivity is something we have, but we don't really mean that. We actually only care about people if they are in like good bodies, if they have beautiful bodies, not if they have big bodies." So, there's some truth there in terms of society still not getting over its sizeism. And it also starts, within us to be able to challenge kind of sizeism as well, because we grew up with those messages. Even if society is changing, we grew up with those messages that our body was only valuable if it looked skinny. So challenging some of those beliefs ourselves is a really important piece of passing on to our kids, not having much of a preoccupation. By the way, we notice around now, or just, at some point during the conversations that are happening ahead of time, there are a number of Black people there, people of color in general, but certainly Black people in specific. And it looks quite natural. It doesn't look put on. So kudos to Lisa in that way. I would say this is my first segment where if producers were psychologists, I think that there would have not only been maybe a few more, but also conversation about who they were and seeing them interact and such. So in the future, something to work towards. We see Whitney show up with Maylee, who's also a new, I think, friend of, is my assumption, but she's friends with Whitney. Whit explains in the car, by the way, with Maylee that she and Lisa are not in a good place because of the podcast thing, which we know about already. We also see Angie go to Meredith and drop down a huge scroll. And on the scroll, she says to Mary, well, what she had done badly by way of Angie, and how Angie was feeling. So the main thing Angie complains about is that when Monica fell in Angie's home, apparently, according to Angie, Meredith specifically said to Monica, you could sue and take her home. Or no, she said you should sue and take her home. Whereas we kind of see in the recording and we hear from Monica that actually what Meredith said was just that she could do that. Or we saw it in the reunion that was sort of what Meredith says she said, was that you could take her home, take her house, take her home for the fact that she fell where there was no railing. So that becomes a recurring theme as well, that Angie is just not getting over that happened. The reveal for the meal is wild. We literally see Lisa build up almost drum roll, please, kind of an idea. Has everybody looking together at the barn door. The barn door screaks hellishly as it opens. And we don't even really see from their view what they see. We just see kind of a side view of the fact that they're going to now look at the dinner table that they're going in to eat at. No one really remarked on it, but Lisa was like, great, here we go. Let's go eat. So everyone goes inside to eat the meal. This beautiful layout on the table. It's kind of wonderful space as well, barns type space. This is first where Angie and Meredith's conversation comes back up about the scroll and still feeling like Meredith said that. Meredith again says, I did not say that she should take her home. And I believe her. I think she might have implied she could, but I don't think she said she should take her house. Angie just says real trashy stuff here. That was a bummer. So she says, I'm never going to be the homeowner again who's spoken to by a renter like that. I don't want a renter talking about my home I own anymore. This is wild, very rude, very classist, which is a sociopolitical moment, by the way, classism. Bronwyn tries to end the conversation. She keeps jumping in and being like, don't you think this might be enough? Or how about now? Can we draw a line in the sand now? Can this be over? Not really. It seems like definitely Angie's going to keep harboring some anger, given some of the rude things she said. Whit, though, has also asked Grace about her gravity and thus her podcast appearance. So what is the deal? Whitney is asking, what is it that you're so upset about? It's a 2-hour-long podcast. It's not like I talked about you for 2 hours. Because basically Lisa says, you spent the whole time talking about me. Not possible for 2 hours. Lisa says, you talked about me enough. Whitney sort of is like, oh, well, one thing is that she keeps saying you're lying, right? Like Lisa's like, you're lying about me. You're lying about me. And she said specifically, you lied about me to disparage my character. And Whitney tells us, I'm not lying. It's just my experience of you. That's not a lie. And then she also says to Lisa, just because I don't kiss every part of your asshole, I'm apparently not good enough for you. So Lisa then starts asking, how did Whitney know what I had said or whatever? She brings up something she knew that Lisa said in a conversation with Whitney and Angie. And Lisa just hyper focuses on that. Like, how did she know that? How did Lisa know how did Whitney know I said that? So why are you focused on this, Lisa? It's to divert attention, right? She really does this masterfully all the time, where she'll divert attention away during a conversation to get out of something that is her fault by focusing on something else that's someone else's fault. And people fall for it over and over again. I very rarely see someone be able to be like, hey, we're talking about this other thing still. Whitney doesn't fall for it at first. She sort of says, I'm not speaking about that to you until you listen to me. But then Heather jumps in and says, I said nothing to Whitney. It wasn't me who told her about what the conversation when we were together, the three of us. So obviously that leaves only Angie as the guilty party. Lisa goes on to say that she feels isolated and she gets angry at Angie for being involved when she fully asked Angie to be involved by starting to ask who said what about their conversation. This is where it kind of devolves. Okay, all of the women start kind of attacking Whitney. We have Heather bringing in shit she doesn't like. We have Meredith saying that Whitney had lied about several things, including lying about Mary's family. So these folks are just kind of banging up on Whitney, ganging up. they're ganging up on Whitney. So they really rest their case, like Heather and Lisa both rest their case on saying that was a fucking lie, which makes you a liar, right? So they're calling her a liar. Whitney says, why are you picking on me? They say, like, you do it over and over and you just make excuses. Lisa says, just in your healing journey, you feel like you're superior and we don't want to respond to that. So when Whitney realizes this is not going to get any better, they're really just ganging up on her, she starts to leave. And she says, I will not be called a liar and you will not throw my trauma in my face, which I think is so fair. I really do. She sort of flips them off. Lisa says, oh, really? It looks like you've really been healing. And Whitney's like, yeah, I have been, because I would never have given you the middle finger in the past. So I'm done sort of people pleasing. And this is where I did another segment about eye spot therapy, because whenever we talk about Whitney's healing, we're talking about the therapy she's doing, which is trauma therapy. She does constantly refer to her quote unquote healing journey. She does talk about Lisa using her trauma against her, but I think it is kind of hard when Whitney does refer to her healing journey a lot. It kind of is hard not to respond in some way to that part of her. That said, it is really messed up to use someone's trauma work against them. Or if you find out dark secrets that they're sharing in therapy and privacy, you absolutely should never respond with sharing that on a show, of course. Yeah, that's sort of the end of episode 1, where that little fight or quite big fight between Whitney and basically everyone happens at the Bezos meal, and she leaves. Maylee and Angie go with her. And Heather makes a comment like, I thought Angie was my girl. And Meredith is like, yep, read that one wrong. So closed the door on that episode. Episode 2, we see the fallout from this party, the Bezos party. Really, one scene that continues in between several other scenes throughout the episode, or at least the beginning of it, is a scene in Lisa's car. First with just Bronwyn and Lisa. Bronwyn being the new castmate with a husband who's 26 years older. We see a scene with them talking and sort of processing what happened. And then Heather joins as they go to Wendy's. So Bronwyn, got the vibe hella wrong in the car, because she starts talking about Whit in just like really kind of mean, gross terms. And she underestimated the Heather-Whit friendship, I think. The other thing that's interesting, though, is Lisa did nothing to help her. She just let her burn herself down, which says a lot about Lisa's friendship. Bronwyn felt like she was close friends with Lisa, but Lisa did not have her back in a couple different ways during that conversation. Granted, she did have her back a little bit. We'll hear later about ways in which Lisa has had Bronwyn's back in some capacity, but during this scene, she really doesn't. She lets her just kind of crash and burn in terms of saying nasty things about Whitney to Heather, in front of Heather. Another storyline that we start to learn about is between Angie and Bronwyn. It is first spoken about, I should say, between Angie and Bronwyn. This is where we start to learn about the competition between Bronwyn and Britt. So it's just Angie and Bronwyn at the hair salon while Bronwyn's getting her hair done at a salon. Angie's there. Angie brings up that there is, she says that she saw Britt, and that all Britt could talk about basically was Bronwyn's coat. And that's the big heart coat that she had called a costume. So she apparently brought it up several times later while alone with Angie. So then we immediately see that in Bronwyn, this kind of sparked a trigger for her. It was sort of like a reminder of being violated as a kid. And so, or, people talking about her behind her back at least. So it starts this very paranoid position for her, where we see her in other settings too, sort of assume that people were talking about her. It's sad. I really hate it for her. In this one moment, though, she says that Brittany's all over the place. By the way, where Angie said that she was with Brittany was at the bowling alley, and we never see that scene. So there was definitely a scene cut, at least the tapes. So, but in response to what Angie tells Bronwyn, she sort of goes hard in the paint. She, in general, kind of does, though. So first of all, let me say, she went hard in the paint right here against Brittany by saying Brittany can't even spell YSL. And she goes, not even the name Yves Saint Laurent. She can't even put the three letters together. That's rough, yo. That is a mean thing to say about somebody. So I think that was also a little much for just having heard that Brittany, wouldn't stop talking about the heart coat. It's a little bit much to go on by saying that. But in general, I will mention too that Bronwyn and Brittany both kind of go hard in the paint in different ways. It's kind of fun. Like Brittany goes hard in the paint of trying to get everyone to like her, and she's, making announcements and toasts at various dinners, whereas Bronwyn is going all over the place by talking about everybody to each other, kind of just saying what she thinks that person wants her to say in a bunch of different settings. So, yeah, it's interesting how these two acted differently, but intensely, to extremes. I will also mention this is where the competition first becomes clear between Brittany and Bronwyn. They're sort of competing with each other for attention from the rest of the group. This makes sense, right? Both of them are in the powered down position because they're new. So they're easier targets for each other than going after someone who has more power, which is basically everyone else. So it's not surprising they go after each other quite a bit here throughout the first 5 episodes. So we'll come back to the B&B dynamic, if you will, Bronwyn and Brittany, the B&B dynamic at the adventure date. So first, a couple more things that happen before we go to the adventure date that Heather hosted. First, we get an update on Mary and her son, Robert Jr. She tells us how he's very sheltered, and she thinks that that's her fault, so that's why she doesn't mind keeping him at home. And then she kind of laughs one day, I'll give him the boot, but not right now. So I made this one of my segments. It was basically, one is like family therapy. So what would I do if a client had this presentation? I would do potentially family therapy with them. Part of the thing is that she would need to scaffold him moving out, like sort of like give him help along the way to being launched rather than just giving him the boot. Giving him the boot is not the solution. I hear you about the idea that like he's sheltered because of your parenting. And I also think therefore your role is not to just keep sheltering him and then eventually give him the boot, cut him off, but rather if that ever even would happen, because I think she's lonely and she needs him in some ways. But if she were to ever think she should be giving him the boot, I would say that she would rather benefit, both of them would, from scaffolding him and sort of having him first get a job and learn like little pieces of autonomy along the way so that then when he leaves, he has the skills he needs, laundry, etc. So that would be something I would do if they were my client. A couple other things happen with their dynamic, which I'll cover now rather than in the future when I go over those episodes in the future. One is in episode 3. Robert Jr. calls Mary and asks for $60. So she tells us about that. That's another step in their dynamic that we see. And then the last piece within these 5 episodes is in episode 5 when they're back home from Milwaukee and he asks again for money. This time they're in person in the house and she says, for what? And he doesn't really answer. And she says, it's used for good purposes, right? She gives him sort of like a plant metaphor and says, what do you need to do? So you need to water a plant to survive. If you don't water a plant, if you don't feed it, what happens to the plant? And he says, it dies. That's right, it dies. Well, he says it dies while like all but rolling his eyes. He's a little bit over it. And then she sort of says, if he's not working, to us in a confessional, if he's not working, his attention span will go down and he won't perform. Because even that kind of language is tough because in some ways it's like setting up this expectation that he be performing rather than sort of, happy and doing what he needs to do to be happy. He can't do those things now, she says, because of his lifestyle. And sure enough, we see him say, I'm going to go lie down again. So I don't know. I think, there's something we're not necessarily seeing, of course, behind the scenes with how he is or what his dynamic is. And certainly I think a good amount of it is her sheltering him as she's owned herself or sort of stunting his, not in a judgy way, but just sort of like halting in some ways his ability to launch because he doesn't need to. And why would he learn how to be independent if he doesn't have to? So yeah, there's that. Another plot line we have going along here is with Meredith. This is a really meaningful plot line. And this is when we see her talk to Seth about Palestine and Israel and that she wants to have a bat mitzvah sort of out of solidarity. I brought this up in a previous episode. I really liked that we heard the history in order to understand her choice to do a bat mitzvah, which is that she is Jewish and all of the women in her family wouldn't get bat mitzvahs, but the men would get bar mitzvahs. So she's sort of saying, I want to break the pattern of women not getting their bat mitzvah as a way of showing solidarity. She also happens, by the way, to be making shakshuka, which is what Aaron made in Real Housewives of New York, season 14. Seth asks Meredith if she really is going to do the whole shebang. Are you going to learn Hebrew? And she said, of course. She really seemed to say so genuinely. So I liked that. He said he'd been encouraging it over the years and she had said no until now. So I think that's beautiful. He's super tearful as they talk about it, as is she, which is super moving. Also, just we know that this is not the first time they've actually had that conversation. They might have chosen to have this level of detail of it on camera, but certainly they've had parts of it ahead of time. So it's nice to see anyway, but certainly, this is something they both knew was coming. I do love that the show raised the topic of the war in Israel and Palestine, the genocide, and also loss of life on both sides. we really don't discuss it on this podcast, and nor did these shows really discuss it, and hence why we don't really discuss it. So it was nice that the show took a chance to show it. And if you go back and listen to our episode in which I brought this up the first time, so right after this episode had come out of Real Housewives of Salt Lake City, you will hear us talk a little bit about it there too. So then we see Lisa and Angie's fight again. Here we are. They meet this time separately, like at a cafe or something, to talk about their fight. And Lisa is so hella condescending. So Angie meets her for a chat. Lisa really won't let Angie talk almost at all. And Angie keeps almost making a good point. Like she'll tiptoe to a good point up to it. And then Lisa will derail it and talk about how she feels instead of letting Angie talk about how she feels. Lisa's just not listening. And then she gets pissed as if Angie's not listening to her. But really, Lisa's not listening to Angie. Angie really never ends up explaining why she spoke to Whitney for Lisa, by the way. We hear her try to make the point that this was to help, and it really never gets there. So it really is just a reminder that no one ever successfully calls Lisa on her shit. She is literally professional at derailing, redirecting, distracting, ignoring. She can really pull that off in ways pretty unparalleled. So yeah, that's where we're at with that one. Whit and Heather have a dynamic going throughout this season so far that pretty much clearly seems to be about repairing their relationship. So obviously in the last season, we had seen them really kind of fall apart. And this season, it's all about repairing. It seems very much like Heather holds the power in the dynamic. Quite literally, we see them go to a crystal shop, and right outside the door, Heather stops Whit and very quietly says, okay, you can get anything you want, but it has to be under $500. What? Why? We never see that explained. We never see Whitney explain what's happening there. Why is she buying her something at all? What is the amount about? Did she owe her something? It's just sort of confusing. Is it because it means something to have a crystal bought for you by someone you care about? I really don't know. But basically, they didn't explain that. And if I were a psychologist producer, I would have explained that, because that is quite an interesting power dynamic that is decontextualized. Basically, it also represents, as I was started with the point of, it really represents in general how their dynamic has gotten. Like Heather really is pretty condescending to Whitney, trying to coach her on how her friendships with the rest of the group should go. But really in a way that seems like she has an ulterior motive of prioritizing her own relationship with the group. So an example of this, and just the idea being that she doesn't want Whitney's relationships with them to be stronger than Heather's with them. But an example of this was when Heather told Whitney to sort of take a beat before inviting people to her trip to Milwaukee, because Heather didn't want it to sort of take the limelight. It seemed like to me, she didn't want it to take the limelight off of her event. Heather had been planning this adventure date, group date, everybody to go on together. And she had already sent the invites, and it was a video invite. And so cute, very cutesy, very demure. And so then we see that that's pretty much the priority, in my opinion, when she's talking to Whitney about when Whitney should bring up the Milwaukee trip. She acts like the reason she's telling Whitney this is that she's like, well, slow down, because you don't know how people are going to feel about you after the other night, like the Bezos dinner, which, by the way, Heather was a major perpetrator in terms of attacking Whitney. But she's like, we don't know how people are going to feel, so just take a beat, see how they are at the adventure date, and then you can bring it up. Again, I think that was a facade for her actual attempt, which was to keep the limelight on her event first. Because the trip to Milwaukee actually is a big deal. Every housewives trip is a big deal. And I don't see a housewives trip usually where one of the cast members doesn't go on it, even if they're fighting with people. They still end up going because it's a big thing. It's a big part of the show. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if producers tell people they have to go on it, the women, because they get a lot of good footage out of trips. So kind of silly that she would suggest that people wouldn't go just because they fought the other night, especially since, again, Heather was one of the people fighting with her and she would conceivably go. So that's where their dynamic is at. We come back to them a little bit later in Milwaukee. We then see Bronwyn at her home. We get to know Todd a little bit better, her husband, and then also her history with him and her own personal history, including with her daughter Gwen, whom she is the single parent of and who is now a teenager. Heather and Brittany we go to next, and they are playing pickleball. Britt's storyline in general is about this guy named Jared Osmond. So it's the nephew of the famous Osmonds. And he is kind of a jerk. I would say has some tendencies that mimic or are narcissistic in nature. She's getting over a Mormon marriage she had and the lessons she was taught through that. And really, they're very clear with us. And this, is very much a sociopolitical moment in terms of the segments, teaching us a lot about Mormon marriages, which they did first with Monica lightly, right? We were more thinking about what Monica did or even the cheating with her brother-in-law. But with the case of Brittany, we're more so hearing about those same details in more detail in terms of prioritizing the husband over everyone else, which is something Heather's told us about with her marriage. And so now we get to see her kind of coaching Britt through thinking about that and how in a Mormon marriage, women feel the pressure to prioritize their husband's needs even over their children's needs, which is pretty atypical. So we get to see that sort of Mormon culture stuff again, through Brittany. Still, we're also, as I mentioned in a previous episode, talking about the idea of women's, freedom, independence, and so forth, and that the marriage in Mormon culture is very, very patriarchal. It's already patriarchal in our culture, the U.S. culture in general. And it's also even more so in a Mormon culture where, as everything goes as the man says. It's in his favor. His needs get met first, yada, yada. Women are mostly like a love object. And to make men look good on their arm, right? So one of the things that happens here is that Britt says, I still have that zest for love, or actually, technically, Heather says to her, you didn't lose your zest for love. And Brittany says, I don't know what that's about. And Heather says back, patriarchy. I hear you, and, it's like it's a both and. It definitely is true that is one form of patriarchy in a hetero marriage, is for it to be prioritizing the idea of love or having a loved one over your own needs. Certainly patriarchal. Women are good as the mother or as the Mary Magdalene, but not somebody who can have their own needs. Both of those types of women do not have their own needs, right? Mary Magdalene is there for sexual pleasure of the man, and Mother Virgin Mary is there to raise Jesus. So women having their own needs, not a thing when you think of those two tropes as being what women should be, one of those two. I would also say, as I mentioned previously, there are other types of love, friendship love, family love, and so forth. And so it's not all patriarchal in nature, but certainly that's a big piece of it, especially in Mormon love. There's also gay love, right? And that might be a little bit less affected by heteronormative standards, and also could easily still also be heteronormative in many ways because our culture is steeped in it. So now we skip on over downtown to the adventure date. This is what Heather's hosting. We've got B&B here going strong. Basically, it's all about the newbies. The newbies. I didn't even do that purposely, and I love it. It's all about the newbies, the new bees. So we've got Bronwyn and we've got Brittany, baby. Bronwyn is coming in paranoid. So we had seen her at the salon talking with Angie, where Angie brought up that Brittany couldn't stop talking about the heart jacket. So Bronwyn comes in paranoid, paranoid. She literally walks up and Heather turns around and is like, oh, hi. And she goes, were you guys just talking about me? Not kidding. She's not kidding. At first it's sort of like thinking, no, she's not kidding at all. And Heather has to explain that they were, and they really weren't because we saw it on tape. So the idea is she went in response to the idea of Brittany talking shit about her, which, right, we don't even really know the balance with which she was talking about the heart coat, but we're assuming it was negative. So that idea then sent Bronwyn through a tailspin, thinking about every, childhood story and so forth to be able to cope with the idea that she's feeling that that's happening again, right? She's sort of almost like thinking about all of it because she's now thought that it's happening now. It all gets pulled up, and it's sort of a way of sort of trying to see if she can either master what happened to her when she was a child or learn about what's going on now from what happened to her as a child. And it all just kind of comes flooding back. So yikes. She ends up getting super paranoid and very much operating off of those memories rather than from what's actually happening right now. She talked about to us in the testimonial, saying that she would, when she was younger, be talked about and put walls up in response. And then she felt like she would always just start to trust somebody and then they would betray her. She says this in reference to Brittany, but to me, it's sort of like we don't ever see her trust Brittany to begin with. So I think we might be missing her bond with her. I think that might have happened at one point, frankly. I really, by the way, would even venture a guess that Brittany talking about the heart coat was really out of preoccupation because she embarrassed herself calling it a costume. So even if she was sort of, shitting on it and being like, isn't that a costume? It's still out of preoccupation with the fact that she put her foot in her mouth. So I kind of feel like that's worth noting. It's maybe not as malicious as Bronwyn might feel like it was. And on the other hand, as I mentioned previously, they both seem to be coming after each other as safe targets because they're both not in the same power position rather than those who've been there longer, every one of whom has more power just by seniority. So I would say, by the way, that this is a little bit of a segment for me as well. And not a little bit. This was one of the segments I thought about as well in terms of whom I'd want to work with and what presenting concern a client might bring that I'd want to work with. And Bronwyn really, I feel like it's a two-parter. So I'd want to work with her around the bullying she experienced as a kid. There's obviously a lot of trauma wrapped up in that, and I'd want to do some trauma therapy around that. And then B, I think there's a lot of trauma for her wrapped up in her baby daddy who died, and therefore her daughter's missing parent, if you will. So there's some clear trauma associated with both things. I would definitely want to work on that with her. Sort of look at it, unpack it, think about the beliefs that came out of it. The fact that she comes to help Gwen in terms of thinking about her dad's family and the way that she really tries to put Gwen first for that was really amazing. It shows, and as she said, she had to take some time to think about it to be able to do that and think about the parent she wanted to be for Gwen. And it was beautiful. I thought that was really neat. We'll come back to that. But Bronwyn comes for Brittany at the meal at the adventure table. So basically, someone's talking about Brittany. Basically, it's Mary talking shit about Brittany. And sort of like, why do we care? Because Brittany made another speech about Jared. And Mary's sort of like, whatever, who cares? This guy sucks. And then Bronwyn jumps in too and sort of says, why is it that every time you say something, it's such a chaotic mess? Sort of comes for Brittany and what she says, which frankly, she said a couple things that are a little messy, but it's not that bad, right? She's just a different person than you are. So then, because Bronwyn came for Brittany, Heather came for Bronwyn and said, you've told every person a different story. And initially giving an example of Whitney, but it sounded like there are 100 other different versions of things she was spreading. So it's sort of like she sort of referenced, it's like, yep, this here, that there, Like Bronwyn's been saying one thing here and something different. And we've actually seen a lot of that on camera. And we've been sort of wondering when it was going to hit the fan. And this is the adventure date time for it. I will also mention that really it's surprising to me that Bronwyn wouldn't think they'd talk to each other. I mean, these women have been friends long before and will be long after you. To expect them not to talk to one another about what you've been saying is kind of wild. Even if it seems like they're fighting, they still talk to each other. It reminds me a little bit of the opening of the season when they're talking about how they gang together or come together even in times that are hard, where like, even though we're seeing them bicker, ultimately they still have a friendship that no one else could understand. It's sort of like when someone's parent is like really annoying and they want to be able to complain about their parent, but as soon as another person complains about their parent, like your parent, then it's suddenly like not okay. And that's actually fair. Like I should be allowed to complain about my parent to my significant other as much as I want. But as soon as they go harder than I do about that parent, my parent, then that's a game over. None of that. I'm always going to defend my parent to somebody else. I'm allowed to complain. No one else is. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. So it's like that, right? Like they might complain about each other, but they still don't want to hear you, a new person, complain even more about them. That's not going to fly. So still, especially we'll hear that what Bronwyn was saying about Whitney in front of Heather and Lisa is the thing that really seems to be the most egregious. That's really stuck in Heather's craw, at least, even though Whitney is saying, she told me she said that. She told me she would felt that way. It still really sticks in Heather's craw, and I do understand that. It's sort of like Whitney is Heather's to complain about, but she doesn't want to hear anyone else complain more about her than she can. Anyway, it is actually kind of impressive, by the way, that Bronwyn did tell Whitney exactly what she had said to Heather and Lisa, and not necessarily in order to cover bases, it didn't feel like, but I was actually kind of impressed she did that. It changed it. It could have been a lot worse for her there. But the other thing that happens at this adventure dinner, right, is that Bronwyn is talking about it and she's like, oh, come on, like you guys were in the car, like, and then she turns to Lisa and she says, right, like, didn't it seem like I was saying something? I don't remember exactly what she said, but like, didn't it seem like I was ultimately supporting Whitney, even though I was complaining about, and basically whatever she had said, Lisa turned to Heather on the table and sort of said, she talks in a different way. And I understand it. I understand what she's saying. It's not like that kind of is her point. So that's defending Bronwyn. Let's just start there. Okay. That happens. Then, and a little bit later, they're talking about a different part of it. And Lisa says, you did get snarky. You have to admit you were snarky, Bronwyn. And so then Bronwyn's yells at Lisa, stop yelling. And Lisa was like, I'm not yelling. That's just how I talk. And Bronwyn just stopped responding to her. And it was clear Bronwyn felt like a little bit dropped by Lisa, just given how intense her reaction was when Lisa said, you did get snarky, you have to admit. So we don't see anything else really there. We can tell Bronwyn's a little miffed by that, by the way, but she doesn't say anything else about it in that moment. So I do understand later when it turns out Lisa didn't really understand. She was so upset by that. Brittany, on the other hand, so that's the Bronwyn drama. That's one of the newbies. The other newbie is Brittany. On the other hand, Brittany is quite naive and really mostly positive, but like super early in life experience acting. It really seems like she hasn't had a whole lot of life yet. Maybe not true, right? But just relationally, she's early relationship wise. So we're thinking about the conversation, first of all, and it's relevant with Heather about the idea of privileging relationships over her own self-growth and her own self-focus. And really, we see another example here that's like a something, if you will. This is the next step in the movement with Jared, between Brittany and Jared. So we see her make a speech at the dinner where she is just a lot of love for Jared. And she essentially says to everyone, we became relationship official on Instagram. And people are like, wait a minute, are you talking about the post he made today? And so they look at the post, and and we get to see it on the screen. It's her in a Costco cart with Jared, and it says on it, like, sometimes you just have to push your best friend around Costco. Best friend, he says, right? So Instagram official, not really. More friendship official. And so, her idea was like, he never puts anything on Instagram, which I totally get that. That can feel really exciting. But he is also labeling her as a best friend. So I also get that. And that's what some of the women tell her. She's also told us that they're on and off a lot. But she then says that he's just asked her to be his girlfriend. But then him referring to her as his best friend sort of makes us wonder about that. Then Mary says to her, basically to her face, I'm just wondering why we're caring. Like, I'm just trying to figure out why we care, which is frankly a little bit funny. But Brittany gets mad at Mary for saying that, sort of calmly is like, why would you say that? That's hurtful. And that was when Bronwyn jumped in with her sort of like, yeah, but, so that's why that starts getting messy as well. I would just say that we really do have a bit of a narcissistic energy happening around Jared. Lisa says to Brittany, by the way, like, he seems to be working you over a little bit. Whitney agrees with her. Whitney even says, we had dinner with the two of you, and it was really clear you care a lot about him. She was like, you really, really like him, and it seems like he cares about you, but he also isn't claiming you, so she sort of makes it clear that she also is thinking Jared isn't as into her as she is into him. So, not great. And then we sort of learn also that Brittany has problems with her family, so specifically her daughters are not talking to her, which is complicated and personal, as she says. And then really it's tough because Mary says pretty hurtfully, you need to do some soul searching. If you're kind, why can't you make amends with your children? And that was a really hurtful thing to say to Brittany. Brittany mostly handles Mary quite well. In fact, I think just because she knows she's in the power down position with Mary, and that Mary's funny even when she's terrible. So she might be aware that might actually be getting her screen time if Mary's picking on her. Mary tells us in the confessional as well that her mom cared about a man more than the 5 children at home. So she found it a trigger that it was clear that Brittany cared more about finding a man than her own children. So this is where Heather's conversation comes back into her front central lobe here, front and center memory system, which is that we earlier heard in the conversation with Heather that was an issue for Brittany of, like, sort of in her Mormon marriage, learning to care more for her husband's needs than her own children's. So sure enough, that could be a piece of why her daughters don't talk to her. Heather probably knows some of those stories already when she was having that conversation with Brittany earlier. It's sort of akin to this idea of sort of being a people pleaser, right? She's like such a people pleaser, she doesn't really have a sense of self anymore. Very much taken from her by Jared or people like him. Maybe her ex-husband was like him as well, where it was too dangerous for her to have her own money and sense of self because then he can't control her, right? He doesn't become her object on his arm, his object on his arm, or so forth. She becomes her own person, and that is too threatening. So she sort of gets worked down as belonging and needing to ask permission from her husband, belonging to and needing to ask permission from. So really tough. And she is another person I would want to work with in terms of therapy. I really want to work with her around loving herself and her finding her voice again, slowly building up that voice in her that stands up for herself, which frankly we do see briefly in a meal with her and Jared, where she does stand up for herself more than I expected, really. When we're talking about Jared and Britt, one of the things we get is, actually, here's the quote of what Whitney said. I see you are really, really into him. He seems like he cares for you, but he should be claiming you as a girlfriend, not a best friend. So yeah, that's what I said. And then that's when Brittany says, that's why I was so excited to do this toast, because it seems like a big step for us that he asked me to be his girlfriend. So one of the things also Whitney says to us in her confessional is that he seems like a politician about Jared, which says a lot, right? Like those are very specific traits. Also traits that typically we find in narcissism. So that was, interesting detail for us. And then one of the things Mary said, right, was the thing about the 5 kids. She said that at home, the 5 of them were just running loose. No one was watching over them or making them feel loved. And then Britt yells at Mary, don't ever, ever, never, ever bring up my kids. And Mary stays actually kind of calm, but says, shut me up, shut me up. Heather tells us on a confessional, Brittany seems to be getting kicked in the teeth and I hate it. So that's just tough, right? We're watching them sort of fight about it, and Brittany's standing up for herself, frankly, to Mary. So something about the kids defending her kids, or something about the hot button sort of idea. And it was cruel. It was pretty cruel what Mary said about, why don't you talk to your kids then if you're so nice, if you're so kind. That was one thing that took Brittany over the edge of not sabotaging and people pleasing. So that's one way we see that could happen for her. Something I would consider when talking about therapy with her, maybe. So then Heather brings up Bronwyn talking shit about Whitney in the car, right? That's how we pivot away from Brittany stuff. And that's where we see the other newbie, Bronwyn, talking about the car conversation with Heather and Lisa about Whitney. So this is a start of a major plot line, as I referenced earlier. And we will hear about it again and again. But at the end of this episode ends with setting up the next episode, which will be in Milwaukee, or starting off at home, but getting to Milwaukee. And Whitney brings up her next drag show group date, which is going to be in Milwaukee with Trixie Mattel. And everyone sort of just has like a little hubbub about it, which is cute. She talks about having booked a private jet to continue with the bonding. And by the way, when they go to get on the private jet later, they say it's Salt Lake City's first private jet. And I was sort of wondering if obviously they don't mean like the city's actual first private jet. So they must mean the franchise's first private jet, which is cute because we really don't see private jets on all of the franchises, but we certainly, or maybe we do, and I just haven't seen those episodes for some of the franchises, but I definitely have a lot of strong memories of the ones in Beverly Hills seasons. So Whitney also tells us there's a bathtub, and Meredith very coldly says, well, I'm not sure if I can make it, but we'll discuss that later, because she's still super pissed at Whitney about the podcast. Another subplot with Whitney, poor thing, at the center of it. That takes us out of episode 2. So I will cover episodes 3 and 4 and 5 in the next episode of Reality Test. So come on back later this week to hear that. And then I might even have a little bonus third part episode. We'll see what happens there with the awards and another Would You Rather round. So come on back. Thank y'all for listening. I hope this was okay with just the one voice. But I really do enjoy going through this season of Salt Lake City. It's a great season already. Lots of drama. There are some plot lines that we can already tell are going to get a little tired, but there are a lot of plot lines. So a lot of threads to keep pulling on. All right. Check out our social medias at the bottom of each episode description. You can find our TikTok at Dr. Realitv, Dr. Dr. REALITV, and our Instagrams at Dr. Raypods and at Dr. Kpods. And our YouTube is at Reality Test Pod, and so is our Facebook page. Please download our episodes. That really helps us with advertising. And what a joy it has been to be here with you all today. So I'll see you next session.